gives me great pleasure to introduce Katharina Kraus, formerly Notre Dame, now Johns Hopkins. And her topic is consciousness and being in Kant and Fichte.
Yes, thank you so much for this kind introduction. And yeah, it's a pleasure for me to be here, especially since I think I first encountered the very theme, cognizing as being, when I first met Therese and we started talking about Aquinas and Kant. And for me, this was not a thing actually in Kant, but as you maybe see, or if you have seen my book that came out of my time at Notre Dame, it was in the end entitled Kant on Self-Knowledge and Self-Formation. I had worked for years only on self-consciousness and self-knowledge, but all of a sudden self-formation and the kind of being that has this sort of self-knowledge and self-consciousness became very important to me. And so from this work, I would like to present a part of it. I will not talk about self-formation, which are what I originally had planned, but I start at the beginnings. So I start with this particular kind of self-consciousness that is often called transcendental self-consciousness, that is connected in Kant with the most puzzling faculty, namely the faculty of our perception. And I try, as many have before me, I try to make maybe a little bit more sense of what is actually going on. And you will see as I talk that there are many, many resonances with the talks we've heard yesterday and today, but there will also be decisive breaks from the earlier tradition. So let me begin. I want to start with some examples here, and examples of what I take to be, or what I want to call the reflexivity of consciousness. So when I see a tree in front of me, unfortunately we are in this windowless room, but just imagine you see a tree in front of you, or you think about your dinner plans for tonight, or you feel happy right now. What you typically can do, and now I go back into the first person pronoun, I, as a neurotypical adult human being, am aware at least of my seeing, my thinking, my feeling, at least implicitly, and in particular I'm aware that it is I who is seeing something, thinking about something, having a feeling. And I can typically explicitly say, if you prompt me to say this, or at least think to myself, well, I see a tree, I think about my dinner plans for tonight, and I feel happy. So this is the kind of reflexivity of consciousness that is so central, that is a central starting point for the transcendental tradition. And so I'm not used to the remote control yet. So here we go. So what I would like to do in this talk is to explore Kant's and Fichte's theories of the self as grounded in this kind of reflexivity of consciousness. My focus will, of course, be on Kant, but then I want to make a comparison with Fichte. So the phenomenon we are talking about is primarily this: when I am in a state of consciousness C, then I'm typically able to be aware of myself, having or being in state C. And that's exactly what I want to call the reflexivity of consciousness. A state of consciousness is reflective exactly then when the subject of consciousness, who is in that state, can be aware of itself having that state or being in that state. So in order for you to follow the talk more easily, I give you a structure at the beginning of it, what I would like to do today in order to shed some light on these questions. What kind of self-consciousness is this reflexivity of consciousness, and what kind of being has this kind of self-consciousness? So here's the structure of my talk. I start with Kant's I think, Kant's famous line about the I think, and look into two different readings that I find in the literature. First of all, the psychological reading, where reflexivity is understood as some sort of act awareness, and then the logical reading, where reflexivity is understood as a kind of self-ascription. And against the background of these two readings, I would like to explore a third reading, which I think is the better way to read it, or has certain advantages over the other two readings. And I call it the hylomorphic reading, where reflexivity is understood as a universal form. I have too many things then in my hand.
What's an option?
Thank you. Maybe later. So reflexivity should be understood as a universal form of consciousness. And what a form is in Kant is, of course, something, well, I want to say entirely different from what a form is in the Aristotelian tradition. And so I will, in a way, flip the picture around. So now forms are not what the mind receives, but forms is what the mind imposes on the material it receives. We will come back to this later. So, and from this, as I said, I want to draw a comparison with Fichte, who is also concerned with Kant's notion of reflexivity, but redefines it, reconceptualizes it as the activity of self-positing, and in this sense stands in an interesting relationship to the psychological reading, but will be different from Kant, and in which way it is different will be a very interesting point of comparison and point of conclusion. From this, in the conclusion, I will then say a word or two about how this interpretation of reflexivity in Kant that I'm promoting gives us a very interesting result for what I call Kant's perspectivalism, where reflexivity is not only a form of consciousness, but also a form of the world for us, or the world of appearances. So this is roughly the structure of my talk. So I begin with introducing Kant's I think in the few famous passages. Discuss the two readings, the logical and the psychological reading, then move on to the hylomorphic reading as a universal form, then dip a little bit into Fichte and self-positing, and then hopefully come to a conclusion. That's the plan, and let's get started. So this is probably one of the most famous lines of, well, I want to say at least of the history of modern philosophy, but maybe the history of all philosophy. The I think must be able to accompany all my representations, for otherwise something would be represented in me that could not be thought at all, which is as much as to say that the representations would be either be impossible or else at least would be nothing for me. So I want to focus in this statement on these lines. The I think must be able to accompany all my representations, for otherwise they would be nothing for me. And from this I want to infer a criterion or a condition for what I call representational significance. So a representation A is representationally significant for me, that is not nothing for me, only if I'm able to attach the I think to it, that is, if I'm able to have the augmented representation I think are. One note here is that if I set things up like this, you will soon see that whatever is spelled out here, the condition, the transcendental condition spelled out here is not only a condition for the ability to think or the ability to cognize objects given to sensibility, but more generally for consciously representing any content at all. So in this very dense paragraph, section 16 of the Transcendental Deduction, in which this sentence I just cited appears, Kant gives a very complex argument that focuses on the notion of apperception he introduces in order to explain this sort of reflexivity. And here I thought I should bring in some more quotations. So here is a very famous quotation. Therefore, it is only because I can combine a manifold of given representations in one consciousness that it is possible for me to represent the identity of the consciousness in these representations itself. So from this and similar statements, we can infer two conditions for what needs to be the case in order for me to have a representationally significant representation, for instance, of the tree I'm seeing outside. On the one hand, I need to combine all the manifold representations, the sensible manifold that comes through my senses in one consciousness. They need to be standing together, that's the unity condition, and so they need to be in one consciousness. And there's also an identity condition. This consciousness must be in a particular way, namely such that its manifold elements are unified in one and the same consciousness, so that it is possible to represent the common identity of the consciousness. And this common identity of the consciousness is often called transcendental self-consciousness, but many people are puzzled over how to interpret or how to understand it. Kant introduces, as you could see from the previous slides, there is an act of synthesizing, an act of combining that is underlying this. And this is tied to a particular faculty. He introduces the faculty of apperception as a spontaneous faculty for synthesizing multiple representational elements into one and the same consciousness. And so we have a fundamental act, the act, say, of apperceptive synthesis that results in a particular kind of unity. He calls it the original synthetic unity of apperception, or also called the transcendental unity of self-consciousness. And so, interestingly, this act is then accompanied, or brings about, perhaps, a kind of self-consciousness. In the A eduction, he says, the pure, original, and unchanging consciousness of myself, in the literature is often called the transcendental self-consciousness. Now, moreover, the I think plays a crucial role for apperception, as you could already tell from the first sentence I read out. Kant often makes this move of viewing an act purely. That means an abstraction from all content, in particular all sensible content, all content coming from the senses. And this abstraction, from this abstraction, then you get the pure representation with which this act is connected. And this general and pure representation of apperception is the I think. So an interpretation has to make sense of this setup of the faculty that has a characteristic act, that produces a characteristic self-consciousness, and that has a characteristic representation, namely the I think. Now, here are the two interpretations or lines, tendencies of interpretations most prominent in the literature. One that I call the psychological reading and the other the logical reading. Let's start with the psychological reading. For the psychological reading, whatever apperceptive synthesis is doing, it's something prior to judgment. And probably prior to conceptualizing as well. So it's non or preconceptual. It's a kind of act awareness. It's an awareness that is accompanies the act of synthesizing itself. And because it accompanies the act itself, we can then later express this act conceptually and just attach the I think to our representation, but the I think is not doing any of the combining work. But this then leads, at least causes some troubles for the psychological reading. Namely, the psychological reading has to explain where the unity is coming from, the unity of the act or the unity of the agent. And so I think it leads to the following problem. The act awareness represents the act or its agent as really constituted as one and the same throughout the act. But that means this requires either some sort of self-constitution through this act of self-observation, or it means we have to presuppose that this unity is already giving prior to the act. So there is the dogmatic presupposition of a pre-existing, really unified subject. Kant is certainly unhappy with dogmatism, and the mysterious self-constitution, well, the story continues with Fichte from there. So the other reading, the logic reading, I think is more prominent in the literature, and it takes the apperceptive act of synthesis to be an act of self-ascription, and in this sense, an act of judgment. So the manifold representations are brought into a unity by self-ascribing representational content to the subject, and then we get some sort of self-ascriptive judgment of the form I think tree. And this self-ascription takes the form of a judgment, and it is exactly this self-consciousness. And here P denotes some apperceived content, and the I, the logical subject that can abstract away from any real constitution underlying. It's just the logical subject as that which is judged about. Now, I think this reading also causes certain problems, namely it causes an infinite regress, and indeed Fichte was one of those first pointing out that an infinite regress is lurking if you think about this kind of self-consciousness in terms of subject and object. So first of all, if the self-ascription or if apperception consists in the act of a judgment where you combine some sort of apperceived content with I think, then you are adding some sort of content to the apperceived content, namely the content of whatever I think has. It may not have any sensible content, but it certainly has logical content. It is about the logical subject. And so we need to explain how that unification comes about, maybe by a higher order act of apperception, and so on. So you get an infinite regress, or if you go for a dispositional version, well, that it only needs to be able that we make the self-ascriptive judgment, then you don't have an explanation for how the unification comes about of the subject and the content. So I think both of these readings, while they have certainly advantages and can make sense of part of the text, they also have disadvantages. And maybe we want to look for another interpretation that preserves the advantages but doesn't have the same disadvantages. And so let me say one word what I take these readings in a way to get wrong. And I think they still construe self-consciousness, or this particular kind of self-consciousness, as an object consciousness. It is about the subject as the object of that self-consciousness. So we get whatever transcendental self-consciousness is, it's a variant of object consciousness about the subject, and that's what leads in dogmatism or infinite regress. So it's either about the real unity of the subject, or it's about the logical subject and the logical unity of I think and whatever content is apperceived. So because of this, I would like to pursue a hylomorphic reading, where reflexivity is understood as mere form, as universal form of consciousness without any matter. So matter has to be given such that this form can operate, but we should not understand it as any matter or as any content or object. So reflexivity is then understood as the universal a priori form of consciousness, and the I think, as we will see, is understood as the conceptual expression of this form. All right, let me say more about this hylomorphic reading. First of all, according to this hylomorphic reading, what apperceptive synthesis is doing is unifying multiple representations, which are then the representational matter, for instance, all the sensory impressions we get from the tree, under a particular form. Remember, and I say more about it in a minute, for Kant, forms are in the mind. They are characteristic for the faculties we have, for instance, the faculty of understanding, apperception, sensibility. They all have their characteristic forms. Whatever matters, representational matter is taken in, these faculties impose their forms on this matter. And I think we want to think along these lines for apperception as well. So a characteristic form, namely the universal a priori form of reflexivity, is imprinted on suitable representational matter. So I want to indicate this in my little drawing, that the lens that has represented the subject is now imprinted on whatever is going on, however content is unified in the mind. So this naturally gives us the unity condition, and I think we also have a natural explanation for the identity condition. So because the form of reflexivity is exactly that common element that is one and the same in all the representational material unified through it, so in a way this form is the same, and it's exactly what relates the content to the subject, and therefore guarantees the identity of consciousness throughout the act. Great. This is the basic picture of my interpretation. Now, I can give you some more textual evidence. I will do this very briefly because I want to get through more material. So I think, interestingly, we find the best textual evidence for this thesis, not so much in the transcendental dialectic, in the transcendental deduction, but in the paralogisms, which are a part of the transcendental dialectic. In the paralogisms, there he rejects the traditional rationalist inferences about the real constitution of the thinker, for instance, inferences that the thinker is a substance, that the thinker is simple, because they claim they can infer it, being rationalists, they claim they can infer it from the pure judgment, I think. And Kant thinks we can never go from a pure judgment to the real constitution. And in this discussion, he points out that the apperceptive I think actually has a merely formal nature. So he says things like the I think is the form of apperception and the formula of our consciousness. The I think is a mere consciousness that accompanies every concept, which is in itself not even a representation distinguishing a particular object, but rather a form of representation in general. So that speaks very much in favor of my interpretation, and the last one I leave for the handout, for you to read on the handout. Now, let me say a few more words about Kant's hylomorphism in general. So if we now understand that each faculty of the mind, and in particular each spontaneous faculty of the mind, has its characteristic form. For instance, the major example in Kant is the understanding with its forms of judgment. So forms of judgment are, for instance, forms of judgment, briefly put, are most of the Aristotelian categories, like substance, causality, quantity, quality, these things. So if the understanding is at work as a faculty, what it does, it gets some sort of representational matter or material and imprints its forms, such that it exercises a mental act. And this mental act should then be an actualization or realization of these forms. So in every act of judgment, a form of judgment is actualized, for instance, the form of substantiality. And the resulting representation, like the judgment, is then a manifestation of the form, of course. And I leave out this last aspect, but I think we can now apply this scheme to apperception, understood as the spontaneous faculty. So we get, in an act of apperception, the form of reflexivity is imprinted on suitable representational matter. Think about the sensory manifold from the tree, resulting in a representation with consciousness. So remember, at the very beginning, I tried to understand, or I suggested we should understand apperception as this very basic faculty producing consciousness. So its results are primarily representations with consciousness that are not yet distinguished, not yet perceptions or judgments, which would need higher order forms. In a particular act of apperception, the form of reflexivity is actualized by a particular individual subject, and I should say in any act of perception or act of judgment, it must already be actualized because it's the most fundamental form of the mind. And a conscious representation that results from an act of apperception then manifests the form of reflexivity as the characteristic relation that any content or the conscious content has to its particular subject. So far, I haven't said anything about the I think with which I started, and so the I think has not shown up yet in my hylomorphic interpretation. And for the I think, I have developed and promoted an expressivist interpretation. So the I think, remember, this first line must be able to accompany. So it's not necessary that it's there all the time, but it's necessary that we are able to attach the I think. And so in this sense, I want to suggest the I think is our expressive tool, like our conceptual expression we can use in order to make this manifestation of form explicit. So it conceptually expresses that this form has been realized. Only the ability to attach this, not its actuality, is a necessary condition of representational significance. And if the I think is attached in an empirical episode, in empirical consciousness, it then expresses the actual perceiving or becoming conscious of some content. So in this sense, the I think expresses the realization of the form of reflexivity without grasping the subject as a content, neither as the real psychological content nor as a logical content. It just makes explicit the form. That is what we wanted if you follow my critique of the other two readings. So I try to illustrate this with a picture. So in a way, our lens not only imprints on this representational material, but you can only tint it, like you can only make it visible by, making it red, for instance. That's like attaching the I think. And of course, if this is a manifestation of the form, it also manifests the subject that has imprinted this form and its formal identity throughout the act. We can also find some references, and I've printed them on the handout, where he explicitly says the I think is a general expression. It expresses the act. It expresses self-consciousness. I should say this interpretation, Kant was not an expressivist. He didn't do philosophy of language or anything like that. And it is unclear whether in the first critique, when he says expression, it's not yet, it's not yet systematically distinguished from representation, but he develops this terminological material or this terminology in the third critique, where he distinguishes between Vorstellung und Darstellung, so representation and mere presentation. And I think so he's not quite there yet, but I think it's the spirit of what he's doing. Okay, because this is about being, this conference is about being, I thought I need to say something about existence, and that will be important for the comparison with Fichte as well. So according to my interpretation, apperception does not imply the existence of the subject. It only implies the existence of the subject if it is manifest in empirical reality or combined with some intuition, so some sensible intuition of myself. He sometimes talks about or he gives several passages where he says something like, the I think expresses the act of determining my existence only if an existence is thereby already given, and if there is a self-intuition in the a priori form of inner sense that is time. So we get any, and maybe even more to the point in the paralogisms, the I think can only be understood as containing the proposition I exist, if it expresses or is combined with an indeterminate empirical intuition, because only an empirical intuition, a perception, can ground an existential proposition. So there is no existence just coming out of the form. We get an existential claim in Kant only if form is really applied to some specific matter. And then we get existence for empirical beings or finite beings. This is another quotation I won't read out because I'm running out of time a little bit. One last comment, perhaps, before I summarize the Kant part, one last comment. We should distinguish reflexivity here from reflectivity or reflection. So on the one hand, I can grant to Kant that he can allow for kinds of consciousness that are non-reflexive. For instance, animals can have non-reflexive consciousness where they don't have this reflexive awareness of themselves being in a state, but that Kant basically says they don't do apperception. They only have an inner sense for Kant. But more importantly for our project here is that this reflexive consciousness must be directed at our higher order capacity for reflection. That means for making judgments about ourselves. And so you can see if the I think is the tool to express this, we have a conceptual tool to express it, and that can also be understood or can later be understood as making a judgment about ourselves, as the logical reading had it. But the important point is that this is further down the line and reads another step of reflection on whatever state is apperceived, whatever content is apperceived, and whatever state the subject is in. And then we can make determinative judgments about our own mental states. This means I see the following levels at work in Kant, and that's the summary of the Kant part of this talk, at ground zero, we kind of get the representational matter coming into the mind, and the first and most fundamental form we apply to this fundamental matter, this representational matter, is the form of reflexivity in an act of apperception. And this gives us, in empirical consciousness, which is indicated on the side with the blue letters, realizing the form of reflexivity by producing a representation in empirical consciousness. This, at the first level where the subject becomes explicit, is where I attach the I think. So an act of conceptual self-expression by attaching the I think. Then we can have an explicit expression of the realized form and the realizing subject in empirical consciousness, and this can then give us the material for our self-reflection, for making a judgment about ourselves according to the forms of judgment, and we get empirical determinative judgments about one's own thinking. For example, I see the tree, or I think about my dinner plans. So this is the picture we get in Kant, and I now would like to switch to Fichte, because Fichte, of course, relates in an important way to Kant's notion of apperception. But things, in order to be true to the Kantian spirit and not only to the Kantian letters, we have to adjust his conception of apperception a little bit in order to be true Kantians. So let's see how this goes. I can't. So first of all, you remember my critique of the psychological reading, that the problem there was, where does the really unified subject come from? And Fichte can be understood as giving an answer to this question by saying, well, this real unity is produced by the subject itself. So the act of apperception is at the same time an act of self-constitution. The subject constitutes itself through the act. And we will see what this amounts to is that whatever the self-producing activity is, it's not only form, but it's a form that realizes itself, that gives its own matter. And I think this is actually where he gets Kant wrong, according to my interpretation. But let's see how that goes. So I cannot say much about Fichte's difficult terminology. I only say the following. Fichte tries to, in a way, radicalize Kant in the sense of becoming truer as Kant himself was. And so he tries to complete the Kantian system by finding the one most fundamental principle that unifies all of philosophy, in particular theoretical and practical philosophy. And the principle he finds in his so-called Wissenschaftslehre is the idea that the I is a self-positing activity. And that's where we should start any philosophy, and from which we should then see how theoretical and practical philosophy unfolds. So the I posits itself purely and simply is the fundamental principle, according to Fichte. And this, so he has many, many different presentations of the Wissenschaftslehre, and so it is sometimes confusing to see what exactly he means. But what we find consistently is that he starts, like Kant, with the examples of the reflexivity of consciousness with which I started. So he starts from look at the wall and abstract from the content of the wall and just reflect on what you self are doing, and then you find the self-reverting, self-positing activity in yourself. So I want to point out 4 claims that Fichte makes about self-positing, and that relate in interesting ways to Kant's apperception and to what I've argued for before. So first of all, self-positing is the essential activity of an I. That's what it means to be an I, is to engage in this self-reverting activity, and Fichte goes as far as to claim that the I and self-reverting activity are identical, he says, completely identical concepts. In self-positing, secondly, the I brings forth, in a sense to be specified, its own being or existence. That is, he says, quote, the being essence of the I consists simply in positing itself as existing. Namely, existing in a particular way, primarily existing for consciousness or existing for the I itself. Fichte has, of course, read Kant's paralogisms and know that we can't move from a mere conception about the I to the real constitution. but for Fichte, everything is still happening in consciousness. So the I posits itself only in consciousness and as existent only for consciousness. Thirdly, in self-positing, the I has an immediate self-consciousness. Namely, the I is immediately conscious of itself through an intellectual intuition it has of itself, the immediate consciousness that I act and of what I do when I act. And finally, fourthly, the self-positing I is an absolute subject. It's absolute in the sense that the subject and object is one. It's an absolute unity of subject and object. You can't actually internally distinguish them. The identity of the positive object and the positing subject is absolute. Sometimes he even talks about a subject, object. So actually, it's unhelpful that he talks about subject and object at this level. He just wants to say it's an absolute unity, whatever it is. Now, just to see the contrast with Kant, for Fichte, self-positing implies existence, albeit only existence for consciousness. I've argued for Kant, apperception does not imply existence, only if there is some given matter that is apperceived. For Fichte, self-positing involves intellectual intuition. For Kant, that's a no-go. There is no intellectual intuition for human finite beings. There can only be sensible intuition based on sensory input. But Fichte needs, exactly for the move he wants, that there is existence for consciousness. He needs a kind of representation that grasps something at once, an intuitive grasp of an activity as living or as a whole, and a concept wouldn't do. So he argues why it cannot be conceptual, this kind of self-consciousness. And finally, Fichte's self-positing points to an absolute standpoint of consciousness or a standpoint of absolute objectivity that in Kant's analysis or structure does not play a role, or he does not go there. Now, is there a form of self-positing? I've argued for Kant that there is the form of apperception, is the form of reflexive consciousness. Is something similar going on for Fichte? And indeed, he sometimes also talks in terms of form and matter, or most of the time form and content. And interestingly, when he starts talking about the essence of the I, we find him sometimes using the form of being of the I, but at the same time, it's also the condition under which this form is realized, that is, has existence. So in other places, he calls self-positing a real activity, and in the sense of being an efficient, really efficient activity, and as opposed to the Kantian faculties that are only imposing form, in this sense, have only formal activity. So I take this to indicate that what is going on the Fichtean picture is something as the following. It is an activity, self-positing is an activity that not only impresses a form, but that actually produces a matter according to a form, or it produces content according to a form at the same time. And so it is a kind of, if there is a form of self-positing, it would be something like a self-realizing form. And indeed, we find passages like the following that seems to confirm this interpretation. As an intellectual intuition, the I contains nothing but the form of I-hood, which is self-reverting activity, which, to be sure, also becomes the content of the I. So, and with this, I want to briefly summarize what I take to be the fundamental distinction between Kant and Fichte here. So, with Kant, we get, in a way, a hylomorphism of consciousness all the way down. So form must always be combined with matter, but matter is something that is primarily giving, at least for us, for finite human minds. Whereas for Fichte, everything I said was to explain human minds. But for Fichte, this hylomorphism stops in something he calls an absolute subject or absolute subjectivity. Apperception establishes only a form of consciousness, namely the form by which the subject relates to its contents, whereas it seems in Fichte, self-positing produces the concrete existence of a subject and is therefore something like a self-realizing form. For Kant, reflexivity is a form of consciousness, but not a form of being in itself, whereas for Fichte, reflexivity is the essence of the I, and therefore we could understand it as a form of being for consciousness. And finally, while I've tried to convince you that in Kant we can stop at any stage, like we can stop at the stage of apperception, we can stop at the stage of making apperception explicit, and each step in my little letter provides material for the next step, so for possible self-reflection. And I think in Fichte, and of course I would have to show much more material, this self-positing necessarily involves the striving towards complete self-termination and has therefore a stricter necessity to how it links up with higher order self-determination. But I didn't talk much about it so far. So let me briefly summarize and say why this interpretation also gives us a way to understand Kant's perspectivalism more broadly. So I've started out with the two readings of the I think, the psychological reading as reflexivity as an act awareness about a really thinking subject, and I've contrasted this with this logical reading, reflexivity as self-ascription of content to a logical subject. And against this, I've argued for a hylomorphic reading that takes reflexivity to be only a form of consciousness. And I think as its explicit expression. But we should not understand Kant's form of consciousness as a form that gives its own matter or that gives its own existence, as Fichte suggests. Now, from this, we can now see that if we follow the Kantian picture, we get something like reflexivity is not only a form of consciousness, but actually also a form of how the world appears to us. And very briefly, how my train of thoughts goes here. If so far, and of course with my motivating examples at the beginning, it was about the individual subject. So our perception anchors all mental activities of one and the same individual subject and relates all its mental contents to that subject. But of course, reflexivity, where he introduces the I think, is at the beginning of transcendental apperception, and this deals with the transcendental conditions of objective content. So it seems that reflexivity is also a form of objective content of judgment. It is a universal form in the sense that we all, or all human beings, share it. And so it is a fundamental condition or a fundamental subjective mode under which human subjects grasp any content in general, including objective content. So in this sense, we can understand the I think not only as an expression of my individual standpoint or my individual as manifesting my individual subjectivity, but as the general standpoint of the human subject from which judgments about the world can be made. And so many more things have to be shown, but if we understand kind of the activity of judging as a purification of all our perceptual content from the particular individual standpoint, I look at the tree from a particular perspective. And if judging consists exactly in purifying this perceptual content from my particular geometrical visual angle I have on the material, then so the form of reflexivity is still there, as it were. So it's still, even if you purify all individual aspects, the form of reflexivity still remains. And so I want to suggest that this can make very nicely sense of Kant's idea that we can ever judge objective contents only for human subjects like us. And then reflexivity becomes the form of the world of appearances. We acquire and assess cognition only ever in a human-centered world. And here the Kantian story stops for now. Thank you very much.